I'm not going to take a lot of time making an introduction because you want to hear from the Senator, not from an introduction. So I think we agreed you're going to sit over that side, I'm going to sit on this side.
Excellent.
And of course, Senator the Hon Bridget McKenzie is the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. And she... great, thank you. Glass of water. Is a Senator for Victoria and has been such since 2011. Thank you so much. And is a regular attendee at these conferences and indeed on the CEDA stage. So, Senator, thank you so much for being here in person.
Great to be here in the graveyard shift of Friday afternoon. So welcome, everybody. Look, I'm standing between them and Arvo Drinks, am I?
There's one session between them and Arvo Drinks after this, which is about transforming cities. And, of course, we're probably going to spend a bit more time focusing on regions and regional infrastructure and so forth. And, you know, as I said to you when we were chatting before, there's been an amazing alignment between the questions that have been asked from the floor, you know, through the app today and the things that we thought might be of interest. So it's good that we actually are on the right priorities, and it's very nice that you're here in person.
I know.
Yeah, last year we were talking at each other through a screen, and it's, you know,
cancellation and delays, as I recall,
all of that,
from the
something
aviation industry, which we've solved.
Airline infrastructure, yes, never. But let's start out. You know, what are your key infrastructure priorities for the federal opposition, you know, that you're thinking about pushing forward in terms of supporting economic growth and development? I always like to start with the big, broad question.
The big blue sky questions, and great to be with you all, and really looking forward to staying for the next session as well. As the Shadow Infrastructure Minister, I'm not just in charge of the regions, I'm in charge of the whole shebang. Similar Shadow, obviously, Catherine King, who you heard from earlier this morning. But for me, coming into this portfolio, I'm interested in supporting policies and projects that really drive our productive and our competitive nature going forward as an economy and as a country. And that means making sure that whatever I get to invest in, if I have the great honour and privilege of holding this portfolio in our coalition government, will be those sorts of projects that make us safer, stronger, more sustainable and more prosperous going forward. And I've always said over the last 2 years that my goal is to obviously hold the Albanese government to account on what they do with this portfolio, but to be as constructive as I can be, to help them be their very best selves, and where they're not prepared to do what needs to be done to step in to the breach and make sure that happens. And I think it's in this portfolio more than any other, it really is the nation-building portfolio. It's very rare that the minister that cuts the cheque is the minister that cuts the ribbon, and you will have seen the opening of the Moorebank intermodal, Western Sydney Airport, sod turning this week. Great projects, one and all, that are really going to drive our country forward over coming decades. And we're a result of consistent and continual focus of the former government, and it just happens to be someone else that's getting the glory this week. But that's, I think, the nature of this type of project. And if you can't, this sort of portfolio, and if you can't handle that, it's not for you. You do have to be, I think, to do this project, this sort of thinking well as a minister and as a shadow minister, is to have that a real forward vision for where you want our great country to be in decades to come, because they're the sort of projects you're wanting to invest in.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that you make, you know, that sort of longevity and being able to hold the vision. And it's certainly something that CEDA's members are very focused on in terms of tasking us with thinking about what we think the long-term vision is for the country, and we've got some really interesting work coming out on that soon.
And I think you sort of see the stop-start nature of things. Governments change, priorities change, and there's nothing worse when you talk to infrastructure companies, large or small, how frustrating that is. And you will have seen, take the Inland Rail, for example, you know, some hesitation from the current government, has seen local subcontractors that had geared up, they'd hired people, they'd bought gear to sort of roll out different stages of the project, have really sort of had to let go of all that as a result. So I think the risks are real for when, and sovereign risks are real for if we don't actually continue the commitment of Australian taxpayers to those, particularly those larger projects.
I think you also have to clearly be flexible about things as well, and things will change from time to time. Do you see any solutions that you would apply differently if you were in government and a situation like that arose?
I really favour transparency. So when we had the big review of Infrastructure Australia, the government brought forward their bill into the Senate, and I worked with the Greens to really put more transparency about the role of infrastructure, the advice to government that should actually be public, it should be tabled in Parliament in a timely fashion, so that I'm a huge believer in ministerial accountability, but also ministerial discretion. It shouldn't be up to bureaucrats, it should be up to people that are accountable ultimately to the people that pay our wages and that vote for our governments of the day. And so, but there should be, if Infrastructure Australia is giving advice on a project, on a list of what they think as an independent body should be, where the federal government should focus, well then it shouldn't just be up to the Minister and Cabinet to get that advice. It should be up to anybody, and you need to have the guts, if you're a minister, to say, well, thank you very much for your advice. I'm going to pick 2, 5 and 7, and here's some other work I've done as well that we're going to invest in. And that's sort of the challenge, I think, for the political class, to make those arguments with community and the broader Australian public that what we're investing in is worth it for the long term, and outline the reasons why.
So getting any infrastructure project done is going to require the people that can do it well, and it requires funding. So I think it would be interesting.
And social licence.
And social licence, yes, we will absolutely
people you're doing
there.
It to or around.
We'll get there. But just thinking about those things, maybe first on the people side of things, we've heard a huge amount today about skills gaps and returning theme of immigration, and when we bring in skilled workers, we don't use them well. CEDA research shows that, many migrants are employed well below their skill level, and that's particularly true for women who come as the accompanying person on with
their engineering or med degree.
Exactly. So what are your thoughts about, how we can navigate those challenges?
Well, I think on sort of a trade and foreign affairs kind of area, getting those sort of reciprocal recognition for a lot of those qualifications, these are serious jobs too. So we want our bridges and our roads and our critical infrastructure to be functional and as safe as we need it to be in this country. And so anybody coming in with those skills, we need to assure ourselves as state and federal governments and private investors that whoever's designing that and working on that has the requisite skills. But that shouldn't be an onerous task. That should be a simplified task. I do think I hear about this a lot, particularly when I'm in our major capitals of Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, about over 500,000 people in the last financial year into our already congested suburbs. And people are really at breaking point. They don't understand why this has to happen like this at the same time that the government's cutting or delaying particularly road projects in our capital cities. And I think it doesn't make sense to people. They know they're sitting longer in traffic, it's taking longer to get home, they're more frustrated. So I do think we need to not simply fuel our economy by pouring people from overseas in. I think that's a really lazy way, and we probably were part of that as well, way to keep your economy ticking over. So the migration piece is an issue. I'm also concerned, though, that yes, you can bring workers in, engineers, etc., but building stuff doesn't just require engineers. It requires sparkies. It requires a whole raft of tradesmen and women. And right now, 50% of our apprentices don't complete of our domestic future workforce, and only 4% of our apprentices are women. And that's really concerning, because you're actually, of the pool of potential workforce you've got to help us build all this stuff is already cut in half, well, half and 4%. And then of that, only 50% is completing. So that's butting up against Jason Clare's desire to have 80% of Australian school leavers complete a degree. So there sort of does seem to be these mixed messages and conflicting priorities when you look at it's not just our road, rail, infrastructure that we're concerned about, the social infrastructure out in our communities, but again, our energy transition infrastructure. All of that together is a mammoth task. I mean, I think for the energy transition, I think it's 30,000 additional sparkies alone by 2030. Now, I've got a 24-year-old myself who's finally seen the light and is a first-year apprentice. I don't know how a 6'7" young man gets through a manhole, but anyway, we won't worry about that. But that's a lot of people to find if you're not going to put that type of skill set on the migration skills list either. So engineers important, so is the rest of the construction supply chain.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're seeing a huge number of different levers that need to be pulled.
And I'm not seeing a lot of coordination. We hear a lot of people talking about the problem, whether they're state governments. We've got a Senate inquiry into the Paralympics and Olympic build next week in Brisbane, so that's an issue. The energy transition, got huge projects that are completely state funded. We've got co-funding arrangements with federal and state governments, all requiring and competing for the same workforce in a shrinking pool. And when you talk about the energy transition, we're competing with the globe for that skill set. So I think there does need to be more coordination at a federal level around that.
So if you did get handed the keys, what would be the one thing you would do on day one? Now, go on, you have to give us the priority. Come on.
Well, I've been a senior cabinet minister before. I don't think it is as simple as having one priority because government is complex and there are competing tensions and competing needs, and it's about where is your priority for the country, and you've got to work with your colleagues to sort of have a cohesive narrative about where you want to take the country. So I'm pretty confident Dutz and I spoke at COSBOA last week about a competitive and productive economy going forward. What does that look like in competition policy for small business in particular? And for me now as the Senior Infrastructure Shadow Minister, it's about how do I get the funding, if I did have that great opportunity, the funding arrangements right with our state governments to capitalise and maximise private partnerships, because I think that's a way we can take some pressure off the fiscal issue, because you want to know what's driving up inflation. It's not your infrastructure projects, it's government spending. So we need to get the fiscal settings under control, and that is the best thing Michelle Bullock could see, to actually start decreasing those interest rates, some sort of common sense restraint on the fiscal side. So a lot of different levers.
There you go. Talking about funding, what would really be your approach to infrastructure funding? Would it be different? And we have a question from the audience who is really keen to know, how do we make sure that existing assets get a bit of love as well?
Oh, I
know. It's not just about the things that are going to turn up with a ribbon to cut.
Yeah, and the press release, right? And you leave it all with local government to maintain for 30 years. Tell you what sends mayors spare. It's like government, state or federal coming in and saying, here's this great project. Now you can look after it and staff it for the rest of its life. So I do think there's an issue with the change in the funding arrangement from back to 50-50. I think that will mean less projects will get built out in the regions, and anybody that's gone anywhere east, west, south or north of this great city will know that you don't have to be in New South Wales. You can be in any single state in this country, and the state of our roads is shocking. A sort of combined problem of natural disasters over the last few years and also maintenance budgets at a state level from state governments. It's just shocking. And when I talk to the trucking industry, the maintenance costs and the productivity costs on them, I know it sounds crazy, everyone's eyes glaze over when you say this, but just a trucking business down in Western Victoria I was talking to, they've got 35 trucks, they run things from Adelaide to Melbourne and everywhere in between. They're going through shockers at a rate of Fort Knox. Every single one is, over 450, and then the trucks off the road. So this all adds to cost at every little point of that supply chain. So I think the 50-50 funding split that the federal government has announced is problematic for those of 7 million of us that live out in the regions, and what we do out there, it's all heavy work, requires great roads for productivity and safety. I do think our federation is problematic in and of itself, particularly around these things. And when you look at who's clipping the ticket on the way through of any contract on these projects, a lot of money isn't going to the end outcome. And you've seen rocketing contractual costs. And so I do think there needs to be a very serious conversation between the federal funder and the states. And if I may say, I hope this will be an okay, friendly room, but I think the involvement of big government, big unions and big corporates, and in the main in this country, multinationals, in these big builds has meant the little old Australian taxpayer is held to ransom at every single spot. And anybody that's involved in setting up these funding agreements, you've seen the skyrocketing costs. You've also seen the very small pool of proponents, and you've seen one very, very big union who's getting a whole lot of sweetheart deals, particularly through Labor state governments. And anybody would have thought that having Labor federally and Labor state governments would have meant this was going to all be so easy. No.
Not so.
Not so.
There's a desire from our audience to hear you address the question of priorities on projects that change when government changes. Now, you did talk a little bit about that before, and I think that's what's got people's juices going. So, you know, there's a concern about what happens with the issue of rework, you know, and value erosion when you get stop-go, when government changes. What can we do to avoid this? And is there some way where previous and current government could actually agree on, you know, the same priorities so that projects that are in flight actually get finished? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think it's sensible. It's very, very hard. I'm thinking about a couple of projects down in my home state in Melbourne. Anyone from Melbourne here? Yay, okay. So I'm thinking out sort of Croydon, out sort of the east way, where we wanted Dorset Road upgrades, Wellington Road upgrades. I mean, these are suburbs that have exploded since I was, you know, running through them from Hillsville to uni. They have just exploded. They're full of young families, etc. And these roads that were built, you know, 40 years ago over paddocks are absolutely unsuitable for the amount of traffic that are on them. Now, we as a federal coalition promised upgrades. People voted for that. But a state government, and we don't own, federal governments don't own the kit. We can't roll over the borders with our bulldozers to start work. We need willing partners in those state governments. And unfortunately, and I believe for political reasons, those projects were never able to be started. And you're right, then you've got a figure on the table of what you costed at in, 2016, 2019, that you've got to find more money for at the next election. And meanwhile, these families are getting angrier, and rightfully so, because they voted for something and then that's not respected by one level of government or another. I think it is an issue, and that's why I think the state-federal relationship about making commitments and having a willing partner is so important, and not playing politics with that part of it. It's similar to, so if a state government comes to the feds and says, 50-50 on these are our list of roads, well, that's what ends up getting funded, but it's not reciprocated. And it'll be the same for Catherine. Catherine will be going through exactly the same problem with her Labor treasurers right now that we would have gone through with our Liberal ones.
So earlier on I said money and people, and you said and social licence. So I think we have to talk a bit about social licence. We had a session earlier today where Erin Coldham from Star of the South pointed out that people in the regions can smell bullshit from a mile away. And I thought, yep.
We grew up with it.
That's exactly right.
That's true.
And, you know, a bit of a sense that there's a trust deficit that comes out of the regions, which is, you know, infrastructure is really being done to us, not being done with us. And an allied question, how can you get smaller companies into the mix on some of these bigger projects? So how does that whole...
Well, the whole procurement piece. Yeah. Look, I think this is the quintessential question for liberal democracies. If we're in North Korea right now, China, even the Middle East in many areas, we wouldn't be worried. We'd build the road wherever we wanted it, right? And you'd be thanking us for us, people. You'd be thanking us for it. In a liberal democracy, there is a social contract and a compact between the citizenry and government. They give a little bit of power up and they expect you to consult them and bring them with you on the big decisions that government makes. I think you're seeing this and the trust deficit with the regions. Why should the National Party still exist in a modern Australia 120 years after it was created? Because it's still not an equal playing field for those of us that live out in the regions. It still isn't. Education outcomes, health outcomes. But are we, you know, that's not because we're not smart. Look at who's running all the, you know, ASX top 100s, overrepresented by people from the regions. Why? Because you can't rely on government. So you have to just get on and get on with it and do the best you can out there. I think... and I'm, you know, everyone's going to say you're going to be political. Well, the reality is that 2 years of Labor has seen every single regional funding program that was in place, 800 projects were sitting on the desk of the department, the change of government from local councils, scrapped. So there's not been one new dollar into regional social and community infrastructure for 2 years. Now, our local councils rely on that to build the school hall, not the sporting facilities, the performing arts centres, and you won't need to go very far. If you're at the ALGA conference in June, I'm sure you'll find a regional mayor that'll tell you what it's like to have that funding pipeline cut. Same with $7 billion out of dams. Over $20 billion in 2 years has been cut out of the regions. So the trust deficit is real, because it is done to us. And so I don't think that's a made-up thing. I think it is actually, they feel it because it's true. How do we fix that? I think it's easier for coalition governments than Labor governments because we come from the region, so you're kind of strangled when you go home if you don't do the right thing. But it is about getting out in the ground and not having this assumption that those from the regions are slower, less educated, don't really know what's good for them. They do. It's just different to what people who live in the city think is good for them. And they're citizens too. They pay their tax too. They have rights like everybody else, and so they should be absolutely listened to. And I think particularly with the energy transition rollout, that's problematic, and we'll probably get to that. But even with things like the Inland Rail, there's been a huge amount of engagement right along that corridor. It's taken years to come to agreements with communities, with landholders to purchase that land so that we have got the corridor for the Inland Rail to proceed. So, you know, we all love to make these big announcements and let's go build a corridor of commerce right through the middle of Australia from Melbourne to Brisbane. There's a lot of different steps through to actually get that train on the tracks and get that product to port. I'm seeing a lot of people smiling and nodding.
We did have a lot of conversation today about that. Now, we are unfortunately well out of time. It's exactly what we did last year. A great conversation. Still so many other things we could talk about. So apologies to those of you whose questions didn't get asked, but the Senator had already asked if she could have access to all of those questions. So I'm sure we'll see answers them coming up in the public domain in the next little bit. So it remains just to thank Senator McKenzie for joining us, and Malcolm Smith, the Cities Australasia leader from Arup, is going to join us now for Transforming Our Cities, which is our next session.
Thank you
so much.